They said it was a place of healing. But inside St. Aurelia's asylum, the prayers echoed louder than the screams. For over 50 years, patients were locked away by nuns who claimed to serve God, but served something else entirely. And when the doors finally closed, not everything inside was human, and not everything ever left. But the true story of St. Aurelia doesn't end when its doors closed. Because the patients weren't the only ones locked inside. Something else remained. Something that still sings psalms when no one is listening. Before we step into the heart of this darkness, tell us in the comments, do you believe faith can drive someone mad? And if stories like this draw you in, subscribe. There's much more where this came from. Now, we go back to the year 1906. The St. Aurelia's Asylum stands as one of America's darkest institutional secrets. Its origins can be traced to a remote hilltop in Westbridge, where an abandoned monastery loomed against the skyline like a warning carved in stone. This 14th century structure, already steeped in its own troubled history, would become the foundation for horrors that modern psychology still struggles to categorize. Historical records indicate that Sister Agatha Blackwood acquired the property in March 1906 for the suspiciously low sum of $1,200. Local newspaper archives reveal that the previous owners, the Diocese of Western Massachusetts, had been unable to maintain the property after rumors of unexplained phenomena drove away 3 consecutive caretakers. The monastery had remained vacant since a mysterious fire in 1867 claimed 12 lives. Sister Agatha's background itself raises disturbing questions. Before establishing St. Aurelia's, she had been dismissed from 3 separate religious orders. Church documents, unsealed in 1972, cite excessive fervor in penitential practices and concerning theological interpretations as reasons for her removals. One document specifically mentions an unhealthy preoccupation with the purification of female sinners. The Order of the Penitent Sisters was founded by Blackwood with only 5 other nuns. All had histories of disciplinary issues within the Catholic Church. None had medical training of any kind. Yet by July 1906, they had transformed the crumbling monastery into what they called a sanctuary for the morally infected. Saint Aurelia herself is an obscure reference. No mainstream Catholic texts acknowledge a saint by this name. The only historical mention comes from apocryphal texts describing a 4th century woman who allegedly removed her own eyes to avoid witnessing sin. These texts were later suppressed by the Vatican for containing heretical elements suggestive of pre-Christian practices. County records from 1906 to 1910 document 127 women committed to St. Aurelia's. The commitment papers, many signed by male relatives, cite conditions such as moral laxity, feminine hysteria, dangerous independence, and most commonly, spiritual corruption. Medical diagnoses are conspicuously absent. The first patients arrived in October 1906. Photographs from the asylum's dedication ceremony show a row of women in white hospital gowns, their expressions vacant or terrified. Standing behind them, Sister Agatha and her nuns appear severe in their modified habits, black with distinctive red crosses at the throat. Martha Holloway's case provides the first documented evidence of the asylum's true nature. Committed at age 19 for unwed pregnancy, her intake forms indicate she was subjected to what the nuns called the cleansing, a 40-day period of isolation, starvation, and continuous prayer. Asylum records clinically note that the patient exhibited expected resistance before spiritual breakthrough on day 37. What spiritual breakthrough meant becomes clear in later entries. Martha was found speaking in tongues unknown to any sister and exhibiting stigmatic manifestations on palms and feet. She died 3 days later. The official cause: consumption accelerated by moral weakness. The asylum operated with minimal oversight from its inception. Inspection records obtained through Freedom of Information requests reveal that between 1906 and 1920, St. Aurelia's was visited by authorities only twice. Both visits were announced weeks in advance. Both resulted in glowing reports despite the facility lacking basic medical equipment and having mortality rates 8 times higher than comparable institutions. The architectural modifications made to the monastery reveal premeditated cruelty. Construction permits filed with Westbridge County in 1906 show plans for sound amplification corridors and penitential cells, with specific notations for minimal light penetration. Most disturbing are the blueprints for the basement level, labeled simply as the depths, which show 5 circular chambers connected by narrow passages, with no windows and only one access point. It was in these underground chambers that the first documented exorcism took place in March 1908. Catherine Walsh, a 32-year-old schoolteacher committed for questioning church doctrine, was the subject. The procedure, described in Sister Agatha's private journal discovered in 2018, involved 72 hours of continuous treatment. This included application of sacred fire to remove marks of demonic influence, baptism in blessed ice to shock the evil from the flesh, and the crown of awareness, a contraption of metal and thorns tightened around the skull. Walsh died during the procedure. Her death certificate, signed by Sister Agatha rather than a physician, lists heart failure due to melancholia as the cause. Her body was never returned to her family. A kitchen worker named Sarah Peterson provided the only contemporaneous account from inside the asylum. In a letter smuggled out in 1910, she described seeing Walsh's body. Markings covered her from head to foot. Burns in perfect crosses. Incisions too precise to be self-inflicted. And symbols carved into her back that resembled nothing Christian I have ever seen. Peterson vanished 3 days after this letter reached its recipient. Her disappearance coincides with an entry in Sister Agatha's journal, removed an infection from our midst today. The vessel has been repurposed for greater work. By 1912, St. Aurelia's had established connections that rendered it virtually untouchable. Financial records show substantial donations from 3 state senators, a Supreme Court justice, and numerous prominent businessmen. Church documents reveal that Bishop Hamilton of Western Massachusetts provided written dispensation for the asylum to operate according to its own spiritual directives without interference. The first indications that something beyond human cruelty had taken root at St. Aurelia's appear in staff records from 1913 to 1914. Sister Josephine began reporting voices in the walls during night shifts. Sister Clara developed unexplained wounds that would not heal. Sister Elizabeth was confined to her quarters after being found conversing with empty air in the asylum's chapel. Sister Agatha's journals become increasingly erratic during this period. Her handwriting changes. References to them and the Watchers appear with increasing frequency. One entry from December 1913 reads, "The original inhabitants have made themselves known. They approve of our work. They feast on the suffering we create in His name." The Easter incident of 1914 marks the first officially documented supernatural event at St. Aurelia's. During mandatory chapel services, patient Rebecca Mills collapsed and began speaking in what witnesses described as a voice inhuman and ancient. Asylum records note that she spoke in a language unknown to any present, yet all reported feeling a profound dread upon hearing it. Mills had no memory of the incident and died in her sleep that night. Sister Agatha ordered all records of the event destroyed, but accounts from 3 patients and a novice nun survived. All describe Mills' voice changing to something neither male nor female, but vast and cold. All report the same final words spoken: "We were here before your stones were laid. Your pain feeds us. Continue." Photographic evidence from this period shows alarming transformations in both patients and staff. In a series of quarterly photographs from 1914 to 1918, the nuns appear increasingly gaunt, their eyes sunken, their posture unnaturally rigid. The patients exhibit signs of severe malnourishment, unexplained bruising patterns, and what modern analysts have identified as dissociative catatonia. Most disturbing are the architectural anomalies that begin appearing in these photographs. Doorways showing different configurations between images. Windows appearing where none existed in previous photographs. And in multiple images, shadowy figures standing in backgrounds where no person should be. By 1919, St. Aurelia's had gained a reputation that kept most local families from sending relatives there. Yet the institution remained at capacity. Patient intake records show an increasing number of women arriving from distant states, often with minimal documentation and no family contacts. Of the 238 women committed to St. Aurelia's between 1906 and 1920, only 93 were ever officially released. Death certificates exist for 87. The remaining 58 women simply vanish from all records after certain dates. No documentation of transfer, release, or death exists. They disappeared completely. The final photograph from this period, taken in December 1920, shows Sister Agatha standing before the asylum's chapel. Modern photographic analysis has revealed several anomalies. Sister Agatha casts no shadow despite strong directional lighting. The windows of the chapel show a night sky, though the photo was taken at noon. And standing behind Sister Agatha is a dark, vertical shape that photo experts have been unable to identify or explain. The last entry in Sister Agatha's 1920 journal reads, "The boundaries weaken. What we thought we controlled now controls us. I see her walking the halls at night, the woman in white with no face. She sings the old songs. The songs from before this was holy ground. God forgive us for what we've awakened." The foundation had been laid. St. Aurelia's was no longer merely an asylum. It had become something else, a doorway to something ancient and hungry. And as the new decade dawned, the true horrors were only beginning. They said it was a place of healing. But inside St. Aurelia's asylum, the prayers echoed louder than the screams. For over 50 years, patients were locked away by nuns who claimed to serve God, but served something else entirely. And when the doors finally closed, not everything inside was human, and not everything ever left. But the true story of St. Aurelia doesn't end when its doors closed. Because the patients weren't the only ones locked inside. Something else remained. Something that still sings psalms when no one is listening. Before we step into the heart of this darkness, tell us in the comments, do you believe faith can drive someone mad? And if stories like this draw you in, subscribe. There's much more where this came from. The 1920s brought significant expansion to St. Aurelia's Asylum. Construction permits filed with Westbridge County show that between 1921 and 1924, the facility nearly doubled in size. The additions included a new east wing with 37 isolation chambers, an expanded chapel, and most notably, an underground complex officially designated as hydrotherapy facilities. Former maintenance worker Harold Winters, in a 1976 interview, described these underground rooms as more like medieval dungeons than anything medical. The asylum's records from this period reveal a systematic categorization of patients according to what Sister Agatha termed degrees of spiritual contamination. Level 1 patients, typically those with mild moral failings, such as questioning authority or displaying independence, were subjected to what the asylum called preliminary purification. This included isolation, sleep deprivation, and forced prayer for up to 20 hours daily. Level 2 patients faced more severe measures. Asylum ledgers meticulously document the implementation of the 40 days cleansing, a treatment directly inspired by Christ's time in the desert. Women were confined to cells measuring 6 by 8 feet, given only moldy bread and blessed water once daily. The walls of these cells were painted with disturbing religious imagery, saints with distorted features and exaggerated expressions of suffering. One survivor, Elizabeth Crane, provided testimony in 1965. The paintings would seem to move in the darkness. Their eyes would follow you. Sometimes, late at night, the painted mouths would whisper things, terrible things that no holy image should ever say. Level 3 was reserved for the most spiritually corrupted, often women who had engaged in prostitution, committed adultery, or attempted to terminate pregnancies. These women were subjected to the full range of sacred tortures that would make St. Aurelia's infamous in later investigations. Among these, the penitence cell stands as perhaps the most psychologically devastating. Measuring merely 4 by 4 feet with a ceiling too low to stand upright, these cells featured a single source of light, a cross-shaped cutout in the door that projected an illuminated crucifix onto the back wall. Patients were confined here for periods ranging from 3 days to 2 weeks. Dr. Martin Schultz, a psychiatrist who evaluated former patients in the 1970s, noted, "The sensory deprivation combined with the constant visual of the crucifix created profound psychological trauma." Several survivors reported hallucinations beginning after just 72 hours, typically manifestations of religious figures who would condemn them. The muzzle of temptation represented one of the asylum's most physically brutal devices. This iron contraption was fitted over the lower portion of the face, with internal spikes positioned to pierce the tongue if the wearer attempted to speak. Asylum records indicate it was primarily used on women committed for verbal impurity or blasphemous utterances. A 1925 inventory lists 23 such devices in various sizes. Maintenance records show regular cleaning and sharpening of these implements. Between 1922 and 1930, the muzzles were used on at least 78 women, with 16 documented cases of severe infection resulting from tongue punctures. The purification baths evolved during this period into an elaborate ritual combining physical torture with religious ceremony. Conducted in the underground chambers, these treatments involved immersion in ice water mixed with rock salt for periods of up to 6 hours. Throughout the immersion, Sister Agatha or her designated representatives would recite Latin exorcism rites while pressing iron crosses against the patient's flesh. Former nurses aide Gladys Parker, who worked at the asylum from 1927 to 1929 before fleeing, described the scene. "The water would be so cold it turned blue. The salt made every cut and scratch burn like fire. Many women would lose consciousness within the first hour, but they'd be held under anyway. The sisters would say the spirit needed cleansing even if the flesh was weak." Perhaps most disturbing was the inverted confessional, a psychological torture method unique to Saint Aurelius. Women were locked in modified confessional booths for days at a time, forced to listen as other patients or staff members recited fabricated sins allegedly committed by the confined woman. Psychological assessments of survivors indicate this practice caused severe dissociative disorders in many victims. By creating false narratives and forcing patients to question their own memories, the nuns effectively destroyed the women's sense of identity. Patient records frequently note breakthrough when women began to confess to these fabricated sins, believing them to be true. The most feared treatment, the black aureole ritual, was reserved for women deemed possessed. This elaborate exorcism procedure, documented in Sister Agatha's private manuals discovered in 1991, combined religious ritual with what can only be described as ritualistic abuse. Patients were strapped to specialized tables in the deepest basement chamber. Their heads were fitted with metal bands embedded with inward-facing spikes, the black aureole, that gave the ritual its name. What followed was a process lasting between 24 and 72 hours, combining electroshock treatments, delivered via a hand-crank generator, flogging with leather whips soaked in salt water, and the application of heated metal implements to mark the skin with symbols that predate Christian iconography. Throughout this period, St. Aurelia's maintained its facade as a legitimate religious institution through strategic connections. Financial records reveal substantial donations from prominent families who had problematic female relatives committed to the asylum. These donations coincide with death certificates for the relatives in question, typically within 6 months of commitment. The mortality rate at St. Aurelia's between 1920 and 1935 significantly exceeded any comparable institution. Westbridge County death records list 119 official deaths at the asylum during this period. However, comparing intake numbers with release records suggests the actual number may be closer to 200. The discrepancy has never been officially explained. Particularly notable is the pattern of deaths that occurred during the spring equinox and autumn equinox each year. Asylum records show an average of 7 to 9 deaths during these periods annually, compared to 1 to 2 deaths in typical months. Sister Agatha's journals make repeated references to these dates as thin times, when the veil weakens, and the others hunger most strongly. The physical transformation of the nuns accelerated during this period. Quarterly photographs from 1925 to 1930 show alarming changes in their appearance. Sister Agatha, once robust and commanding, appears increasingly skeletal, her eyes sunken to an unnatural degree. Similar changes appear in all long-term staff members. More disturbing are the physical anomalies that begin appearing in these photographs. Sister Clara's hands appear elongated, with fingers approximately 30% longer than in earlier images. Sister Josephine's official photographs show increasingly pronounced discoloration around her eyes and mouth. And in group photographs, the nuns' shadows sometimes fall in directions inconsistent with the visible light sources. By 1927, the supernatural manifestations at St. Aurelia's had become impossible to conceal from staff. Maintenance logs document 37 separate incidents of unexplained phenomena that year alone, including doors locking and unlocking without human intervention, voices emanating from empty rooms, often described as chanting in unknown languages, drastic temperature drops in specific areas, particularly the original chapel, religious icons found reversed or modified overnight, unexplained scratching sounds within the walls. Of particular note is the first documented appearance of the woman in white, an apparition reported by multiple staff members and even visiting clergy. Description consistently mention a female figure in a white gown wandering the upper floors at night, her face either obscured or, in some accounts, missing entirely. Her presence was often accompanied by the smell of wet earth and something sweet but rotten. Father Michael Donovan, who served as visiting chaplain from 1926 to 1928, left the only official church record of these phenomena. In a letter to his bishop, subsequently buried in diocesan archives until 1987, he wrote, "Something walks these halls that wears human shape but is not human. The sisters have changed. Their prayers have changed. They speak words that sound like Latin but are not any Latin taught by Holy Mother Church. I fear they no longer serve our Lord but something far older and hungrier." Father Donovan was reassigned 2 weeks after sending this letter. His replacement, Father Thomas Williams, stayed only 6 months before suffering what church records describe as a complete nervous collapse. He spent the remainder of his life in a church facility, reportedly unable to speak and violently reactive to religious imagery. The early 1930s brought increased isolation to St. Aurelia's. Local businesses stopped making deliveries to the asylum. Mail service became irregular. The road leading to the facility fell into disrepair as county maintenance crews refused to work there. Sister Agatha's journals from this period show increasing paranoia, with frequent references to enemies and those who would interfere with the sacred work. The most significant incident of this period occurred on November 1, 1932, All Saints' Day. During mandatory chapel services, all lights reportedly extinguished simultaneously. Multiple witnesses described seeing figures moving through the darkness, shapes like nuns but too tall and moving wrong. When emergency lamps were lit 7 minutes later, 3 patients were found dead in their pews, their eyes open and their mouths stretched in expressions of terror. No cause of death was ever determined. In 1933, Sister Agatha implemented new security measures, including locks on patient doors that could only be opened from the outside and barred windows throughout the facility. Her journals indicate these measures were designed not to keep patients in, but to keep the others contained. That same year, she ordered the sealing of the original monastery crypt, a circular chamber beneath the main chapel. Construction records indicate the doorway was not merely locked but filled with concrete and covered with religious symbols. The final years of this period show increasing instability in the asylum's operations. Staff turnover reached unprecedented levels, with new hires rarely lasting more than a few months. Patient treatment records become erratic and sometimes contradictory, with handwriting changing dramatically mid-entry. Financial records show large expenditures for unexplained structural modifications and protective measures. Most telling is the evolution of Sister Agatha's signature in official documents. Analysis by handwriting experts in 1990 indicated that the signature from 1935 was made by a physically different person than the one who signed documents in 1920, despite both bearing the name Sister Agatha Blackwood. The last coherent entry in Sister Agatha's journal, dated April 17, 1935, reads, "They are no longer content to watch. They move among us now, wearing familiar faces. I can no longer trust my sisters. I can no longer trust my own reflection. The rituals no longer contain them. They strengthen them. God forgive us, we did not create a place of healing. We created a doorway. And now we stand on the wrong side." By 1935, St. Aurelia's had transformed from a mere institution of cruelty into something far more sinister, a place where the boundary between our world and something else had worn dangerously thin. The sacred tortures had evolved beyond mere human brutality. They had become rituals feeding something ancient and patient, something that had found in Sister Agatha and her nuns the perfect servants for a hunger older than Christianity itself. And as 1935 drew to a close, that hunger was growing. They said it was a place of healing. But inside St. Aurelia's asylum, the prayers echoed louder than the screams. For over 50 years, patients were locked away by nuns who claimed to serve God, but served something else entirely. And when the doors finally closed, not everything inside was human, and not everything ever left. But the true story of St. Aurelia doesn't end when its doors closed. Because the patients weren't the only ones locked inside. Something else remained. Something that still sings psalms when no one is listening. Before we step into the heart of this darkness, tell us in the comments, do you believe faith can drive someone mad? And if stories like this draw you in, subscribe, there's much more where this came from. In December 1935, a significant shift occurred in St. Aurelia's leadership. Sister Agatha disappeared from all official documentation. No death certificate was filed, no transfer recorded. Her name simply vanishes from the asylum's records. Sister Meredith Hartford, previously a minor figure in the institution's hierarchy, suddenly appears as the new Mother Superior with no explanation for the transition. Under Sister Meredith's leadership, the asylum's focus shifted from treatment to containment. Construction records from 1936 show extensive renovations to the underground levels, particularly the sealed crypt area that Sister Agatha had ordered concreted shut. Expense reports list unusual materials including specialized lead lining, silver-infused mortar, and most disturbing, sanctified chains purchased from a monastery in Eastern Europe. The asylum's medical records from this period reveal a troubling pattern. Between 1936 and 1940, patient deaths officially decreased by 73%. Yet release records show no corresponding increase. The total patient population remains stable despite significantly reduced death certificates. The explanation for this statistical anomaly would not be discovered until decades later. In 1938, a county water inspector named Robert Chambers made an unofficial visit to the asylum grounds. Concerned about contamination in the local watershed, he took samples from the small river that ran behind the asylum property. His private journal, discovered after his suicide in 1941, describes what he witnessed. Observed religious sisters carrying wrapped bundles from the rear entrance to the old monastery gardens after midnight. The bundles were approximately the size and shape of human bodies. They buried them in unmarked plots behind the stone wall. Chambers' water samples revealed alarming levels of decomposition-related chemicals and human biological material. His attempts to report these findings to local authorities were repeatedly blocked. His journal's final entry reads, "They watch my house now. I see the sisters standing across the street at night. Except they don't move like women anymore. They don't move like anything human." The asylum's financial records from 1938 to 1942 show substantial expenditures for grounds maintenance and waste disposal, despite no visible improvements to the facility's exterior. Aerial photographs from a 1939 county survey reveal disturbed earth in a pattern of concentric circles behind the asylum's north wall, an area previously used as the monastery's cemetery centuries earlier. The first concrete evidence of what was actually occurring came in spring 1943, when severe flooding washed out a section of the asylum's perimeter wall. Local farmer Thomas Whitaker discovered partially decomposed human remains that had been exposed by the floodwaters. County records indicate an initial investigation was launched but abruptly terminated after the intervention of both church officials and a state senator whose niece had been committed to St. Aurelia's 5 years earlier. The flood, however, had exposed more than bodies. Geological surveys conducted in 1944 for unrelated county planning revealed that the bedrock beneath St. Aurelia's contained a network of natural caves and tunnels. These caverns extended beneath the original monastery foundations and connected to several sinkhole formations in the surrounding forest. More significantly, they provided access to the sealed crypt that had once been part of the original 14th-century structure. Sister Meredith's private correspondence, seized during later investigations, reveals she was fully aware of these subterranean features. The ancients chose this ground for a reason. The network below serves our purpose perfectly. What was once sealed can now be accessed through alternate means. The vessels are placed as directed, in concentric rings around the central chamber. By vessels, Sister Meredith was referring to human bodies. Forensic analysis conducted in 1970 would later confirm that between 1936 and 1950, at least 117 women died at St. Aurelia's. Few received official death certificates. Instead, their bodies were interred in a ritualistic pattern in the ground above the cave system. Each burial followed a specific orientation, with the heads pointing toward the center of the pattern, directly above the sealed crypt. Even more disturbing were the conditions of the remains. Forensic examinations revealed evidence of postmortem modifications, primarily the removal of specific organs and the carving of symbols into the sternum and skull. These symbols matched no known religious iconography but bore similarities to pre-Christian artifacts found in the region dating back to Native American settlements and possibly earlier. The asylum's operating procedures during this period show a methodical approach to death. Patient records repeatedly use the phrase, failed vessel, to describe those who died during treatments. More disturbing is the recurrence of the term, suitable vessel applied to certain patients, particularly those who exhibited what staff notes called receptiveness to the voices. Throughout the 1940s, St. Aurelia's maintained increasingly strict isolation from outside scrutiny. The few official visitors were restricted to the main administrative areas and a carefully maintained showcase ward, where healthier patients demonstrated appropriate religious devotion and gratitude. Behind this facade, the asylum had evolved into something that resembled a cult more than a medical facility. Staff journals from this period describe increasingly elaborate rituals conducted on specific astronomical dates. The spring equinox, fall equinox, and winter solstice received particular emphasis. These ceremonies took place in the asylum's chapel, which had been modified with unusual features including a secondary altar facing west rather than east, black candles made with unusual substances, and modified religious iconography where traditional saints' faces had been replaced with blank, smooth surfaces. The most significant development during this period was the formal documentation of what staff called the visitation. Multiple independent accounts describe the same phenomenon, a female figure in white appearing in patients' rooms at night. Unlike earlier sightings where the figure's face was described as obscured or missing, reports from this period consistently mention a face like polished stone, with eyes that showed something ancient looking out. Patient interviews from this period, recorded by a visiting psychiatric consultant who was subsequently removed from his position, contain recurring descriptions of this entity. Most disturbing is the consistency with which patients, isolated from one another, describe the entity's communication. She doesn't speak with her mouth. The words appear directly in your mind. She says this was her place before the stone walls rose. She says the sisters are preparing the way for her return. By 1945, the physical transformation of the nuns had progressed to a point that required active concealment. Photographs from official diocesan visits show the sisters wearing modified habits with higher necklines, longer sleeves, and veils that extended further forward to shadow their faces. Those few images that do clearly show the nuns' features reveal alarming changes, particularly around the eyes, which appear larger and set differently in their sockets. The asylum's operational records from 1946 to 1948 document an increasing preoccupation with the original monastery crypt. Maintenance logs show weekly inspections of the sealed entrance despite its supposed inaccessibility. Engineering consultations were commissioned regarding the structural integrity of subterranean chambers. Most tellingly, Sister Meredith's personal calendar marks a monthly ritual described only as communion with the depth. In spring 1947, neighboring properties reported unusual phenomena coinciding with these monthly observances. Livestock refused to sleep on nights when the ritual took place. Electronic devices malfunctioned. Multiple residents described hearing chanting that seemed to come from inside the earth itself. Local police records show increased calls about unidentified persons seen walking toward the asylum on these nights, described as moving oddly and leaving no footprints in mud. The first definitive connection between these activities and the buried bodies came in 1948, when groundskeeper William Parker attempted to plant new trees in the north garden as part of routine maintenance. His work diary, later recovered during investigations, describes what happened. Shovel hit something soft at 3 feet depth. Not earth. Exposed what appeared to be human remains, partially decomposed. Most disturbing was movement observed among the remains. Reported to Sister Meredith, who instructed immediate reburial and relocation of planned garden. Parker disappeared 2 weeks later. His replacement was instructed never to dig deeper than 2 feet in any part of the grounds. The final years of this period show St. Aurelia's reaching its most extreme isolation from outside oversight. Mail delivery ceased entirely. Supply deliveries were left at the gate rather than brought inside. The access road was blocked with a new gate featuring unusual symbols worked into the ironwork, symbols that matched those found carved into the bodies buried on the grounds. In late 1949, Sister Meredith's journal contains the first reference to the awakening, an event she anticipated would occur on the winter solstice of 1950. Her entries become increasingly erratic, mixing English with Latin and another language linguists have been unable to identify. The final legible entry, dated November 3, 1950, reads, "The vessels are properly aligned. The boundary thins. She walks among us now almost constantly. Soon the transformation will be complete, and what was buried will fully awaken." Whatever was planned for the winter solstice never occurred. On December 1, 1950, a massive fire broke out in the asylum's east wing. County fire response was delayed by the blocked access road and non-functional water mains. By the time emergency services gained entry to the grounds, the fire had consumed approximately 40% of the facility. The official report lists 17 casualties, though no remains were recovered. More significant was the structural damage to the underground portions of the facility. The fire had weakened key support structures, causing partial collapse of the tunnel system leading to the crypt. Engineering assessments conducted in January 1951 declared these areas permanently inaccessible due to instability. Sister Meredith survived the fire but was described as profoundly altered by witnesses. Photographs taken during the investigation show her being escorted from the premises, her habit partially burned away, revealing skin with an unusual gray pallor and what appear to be ritualistic scarifications covering her exposed arms and neck. The asylum continued to operate after the fire, but with significantly reduced capacity and under increased scrutiny. The period from 1935 to 1950 had transformed St. Aurelia's from a place of cruel treatment into something far more sinister, a focal point for ritualistic activity centered around the buried dead and whatever lay beneath them in the sealed crypt. What actually dwelled in those subterranean chambers, and what the sisters had hoped to accomplish through their macabre burial patterns, would remain undiscovered for years. But the consequences of their actions had only begun to manifest. They said it was a place of healing, but inside St. Aurelia's asylum, the prayers echoed louder than the screams. For over 50 years, patients were locked away by nuns who claimed to serve God, but served something else entirely. And when the doors finally closed, not everything inside was human, and not everything ever left. But the true story of St. Aurelia doesn't end when its doors closed. Because the patients weren't the only ones locked inside. Something else remained. Something that still sings psalms when no one is listening. Before we step into the heart of this darkness, Tell us in the comments. Do you believe faith can drive someone mad? And if stories like this draw you in, subscribe. There's much more where this came from. The 1950 fire marked a turning point for St. Aurelius. County records show that the asylum operated at reduced capacity, housing only 47 patients compared to its pre-fire population of 112. The damaged east wing remained condemned, sealed behind hastily constructed barriers that internal maintenance logs describe as reinforced with unusual materials, including silver filings and crushed bone. Sister Meredith retained her position as Mother Superior, though diocesan communications express concern about her increasingly erratic behavior and theological deviations. Church investigators sent in February 1951 reported that regular Catholic services had been replaced with ceremonies incorporating elements foreign to approved doctrine, including inverted crosses and modifications to traditional prayers. The most significant development following the fire was the documented increase in paranormal phenomena. Where previous manifestations had been primarily confined to specific areas, particularly near the sealed crypt, reports from 1951 to 1955 describe activity throughout the facility. Maintenance logs document unexplained sounds including weeping from empty rooms and chanting from inside the walls. Dramatic temperature fluctuations, with certain rooms dropping below freezing even during summer months. Objects moving without human intervention, particularly religious items being inverted or modified. Doors locking and unlocking autonomously, often trapping staff in rooms for hours. Water fixtures running black liquid described as too thick to be water, with the scent of old graves. The transformation of the nuns accelerated during this period. Quarterly photographs reveal alarming physical changes, particularly among those who had served at the asylum for more than 5 years. Medical examinations conducted by diocesan authorities in 1952 document unusual findings including skin with gray pallor and unusual texture, visual sensitivity requiring near-constant darkness, and most disturbing, anomalous growths along the spinal column. Patient experiences underwent a fundamental shift. Where previous treatments had focused on physical and psychological torture with religious justifications, records from this period show an emphasis on what staff called communion. Patients were subjected to extended isolation in darkness while being made to listen to recordings of chanting in unknown languages. Medical charts refer to receptivity and suitability as vessels rather than treatment progress. The most disturbing accounts come from 3 patients who escaped briefly in April 1953. Before being recaptured, they provided statements to local police that were subsequently buried until 1972. All 3 independently described witnessing the nuns gathering in the chapel at midnight, removing their habits to reveal bodies that were no longer fully human, with elongated limbs and skin that moved independently as if something dwelled beneath it. The escapees further reported that certain patients were being taken to the partially collapsed areas near the old crypt for special communion. None of these patients were ever seen again. The escape report notes that when officers visited the asylum to investigate these claims, Sister Meredith refused them entry to the lower levels, claiming structural instability made access unsafe. By 1955, St. Aurelia's had effectively stopped admitting new patients. Those who remained were increasingly isolated from outside contact. Mail service was completely discontinued. Family visitation, already restricted, ceased entirely. Supply deliveries were accepted only from specific vendors who, financial records reveal, received payments far exceeding the value of goods provided. The woman in white, the entity first documented in the 1920s, became a near-constant presence. Night staff logs from 1956 to 1958 contain almost nightly reports of her apparition, now described as moving with unnatural fluidity and able to pass through solid barriers. Multiple witnesses reported that she was often accompanied by smaller figures that moved in a crawling manner and left trails of moisture on the floors. Perhaps most telling is the evolution of Sister Meredith's private chapel, revealed in photographs taken during a rare diocesan inspection in 1957. The traditional altar had been replaced with a circular stone table bearing inscriptions that predate Christianity. Religious imagery had been modified to remove the faces of holy figures, replacing them with smooth, blank surfaces. Most alarming was a life-sized statue of a female figure, ostensibly the Virgin Mary, that bore no resemblance to traditional depictions, instead featuring elongated limbs and a face described in the inspector's report as reminiscent of no human expression I have ever witnessed. The asylum's isolation reached its peak following this inspection. The access road was blocked by fallen trees that county services were inexplicably never dispatched to remove. Telephone lines were reported damaged during a storm in January 1958 and never repaired. Local residents reported avoiding the area entirely, describing feelings of profound dread and being watched by something hostile when approaching within a mile of the grounds. The final phase of St. Aurelia's active operation is documented primarily through the journal of Dr. Eleanor Wright, a psychiatrist sent by state authorities in June 1960 to evaluate the facility's continued licensure. Dr. Wright's journal, discovered among her effects after her suicide in 1965, provides the most comprehensive first-hand account of the asylum's final years. Wright described finding only 23 patients still in residence, all exhibiting similar unusual symptoms: abnormal sensitivity to light, unresponsiveness to pain, and a tendency to speak in unison without apparent communication. More disturbing was her observation that patients seemed to anticipate her questions before she asked them, often providing answers to thoughts she had not verbalized. The staff had dwindled to Sister Meredith and 7 other nuns, all of whom Wright described as severely emaciated yet moving with unnatural strength. She noted they rarely ate in her presence and seemed to communicate without speaking. Most alarmingly, she documented that their shadows sometimes moved independently from their bodies, particularly in the presence of religious symbols. Wright's most significant discovery came when she gained access to patient medical records. Recent entries revealed that traditional treatments had been replaced entirely with preparation rituals, focusing on thinning the vessel walls and creating receptivity to the other. Medication logs showed the administration of unidentified compounds with names in an unrecognizable language, described as sourced from the depths. On her 3rd night at the facility, Wright reported hearing chanting from the sealed East Wing despite its supposed abandonment. Investigating against explicit instructions, she observed the nuns gathered in what remained of the old chapel, arranged in a circle around a hole in the floor. Her journal describes, "They were removing their habits and outer skin simultaneously, as if shedding a single garment. What emerged bore only passing resemblance to human form. In the center of their circle stood the woman in white, now clearly visible. Her face is not absent as rumors suggested. It is simply not a face that can exist in our understanding of anatomy." Wright fled the asylum the following morning. Her report to state authorities resulted in an official inspection scheduled for November 1962. This inspection never occurred due to what county records describe as scheduling complications. Unofficial sources suggest the inspection team refused to enter the grounds after experiencing what their preliminary report called immediate and profound psychological distress upon approaching the gates. The most significant documentation from this final period comes from Sister Meredith herself. A journal recovered during later investigations contains entries from 1960 to 1962 written in multiple languages, some still untranslated. The legible portions describe the merging and the final communion planned for All Saints' Day, 1963. Her final coherent entry, dated October 28, 1962, reads, "The vessels are prepared. The boundaries dissolve. She has shown us her true face and promised transformation. What was buried shall rise. What was silenced shall speak." The cycle completes where it began, in the original foundation stones. We have served faithfully and will be rewarded with transcendence. The most compelling physical evidence from this period emerged during renovations in 1990, when workers discovered a sealed room in the collapsed East Wing. Inside was a circle of 9 chairs, each containing human remains in advanced stages of decomposition. Analysis indicated the individuals had died approximately 30 years earlier, Yet their bodies showed minimal decay despite the absence of preservation methods. More disturbing was the condition of the remains. Each skeleton showed extensive modification, including elongated vertebrae, unusual growth patterns in the cranium, and most significantly, secondary bone structures emerging from the rib cage in patterns inconsistent with any known human deformity. DNA testing proved inconclusive, with results described in laboratory reports as containing sequences not consistent with human genome. By late 1962, St. Aurelia's had ceased to function as any recognizable institution. What remained was a shell inhabited by entities that bore only passing resemblance to the nuns who had founded it. The asylum had become a threshold between worlds, a place where the boundary between our reality and something older and hungrier had worn dangerously thin. The stage was set for the final chapter in St. Aurelia's operational history, the events of November 1, 1963, that would finally close its doors, but fail to contain what had awakened inside. They said it was a place of healing, but inside St. Aurelia's asylum, the prayers echoed louder than the screams. For over 50 years, patients were locked away by nuns who claimed to serve God, but served something else entirely. And when the doors finally closed, not everything inside was human, and not everything ever left. But the true story of St. Aurelia doesn't end when its doors closed. Because the patients weren't the only ones locked inside. Something else remained. Something that still sings psalms when no one is listening. Before we step into the heart of this darkness, tell us in the comments, do you believe faith can drive someone mad? And if stories like this draw you in, subscribe. There's much more where this came from. The events of November 1, 1963, All Saints' Day, remain the most documented yet least understood chapter in St. Aurelia's history. What began as a routine wellness check by local authorities ended with the permanent closure of the facility and multiple unexplained deaths. Police records indicate that Officer James Harrington and Deputy Michael Collins were dispatched to St. Aurelia's after multiple reports of unusual lights and sounds like screaming coming from the supposedly near-abandoned facility. Their patrol vehicle's radio log, recovered during subsequent investigations, contains their final communication, approaching main entrance. Structure appears. Jesus Christ, the walls are moving. Request immediate backup. When additional officers arrived 30 minutes later, they found the patrol car empty, its doors open and engine running. The asylum's main gate stood open for the first time in years. The official report describes an unusual atmospheric condition surrounding the building, a mist or fog that seemed to move with purpose and carrying the scent of wet stone and decomposition. What the responding officers discovered inside defies conventional explanation. The main chapel had been transformed into what the report clinically terms a ritual space. The pews had been arranged in concentric circles around a hole in the floor that accessed the previously sealed crypt. The walls were covered with symbols drawn in substances later identified as a mixture of human blood and an unidentified black pigment. Most significantly, they discovered Sister Meredith Hartford. The official police photograph, still sealed from public view but described in court documents, shows her body suspended from the chapel ceiling in a position that mimicked crucifixion but inverted. The autopsy report notes that the body exhibited extensive modification inconsistent with standard human anatomy, including an elongated spine, additional joints in the limbs, and skin with an unusual texture resembling something between human dermis and reptilian scales. Most disturbing was the phrase "Ora pro nobis," pray for us, burned into her back, not carved or written, but seemingly branded from within, the flesh pushed outward as if by internal pressure. The coroner's report states, the tissue appears to have been altered at a cellular level through means beyond current medical understanding. The remaining patients, 16 in total, were found in various locations throughout the facility, all deceased. Cause of death was listed as systemic organ failure, though autopsies revealed no obvious trauma or disease. The most unusual finding was that all victims showed signs of accelerated decomposition despite having died only hours earlier. More alarming, all bodies were positioned facing the chapel, regardless of where in the facility they were found. Officers Harrington and Collins were discovered in the subbasement near the collapsed entrance to the original crypt. Collins was deceased, his body exhibiting the same accelerated decomposition as the patient's. Harrington survived but was described as catatonic and non-responsive to stimuli. He remained institutionalized until his death in 1979, never speaking again except to repeat a single phrase, "She wears their faces now." The official investigation concluded within weeks, an unusually swift resolution for an incident involving multiple deaths. County records reveal unusual involvement from federal authorities and diocesan officials, who jointly ordered the facility sealed. By December 1963, St. Aurelia's was officially closed, its records confiscated, and access to the grounds prohibited by order of both church and state. What followed was decades of deliberate obscurity. The access road was removed from county maps. Local newspapers were discouraged from referencing the asylum or its closure. Former patients and staff who attempted to speak publicly about their experiences reported intimidation from both religious and government representatives. The veil of silence lifted partially in 1972, when journalist Rebecca Winters published an unauthorized history titled The Saints of Suffering, based on leaked documents and interviews with former patients. Winters' work revealed the asylum's horrific treatments and high mortality rate but avoided discussion of the supernatural elements, focusing instead on institutional abuse. 3 weeks after publication, Winters was found dead in her apartment from an apparent suicide. Her research notes and interview recordings were missing. The medical examiner's report notes an unusual detail. The words, ora pro nobis, were found written repeatedly in Winters' journal in handwriting that graphology experts confirmed did not match her own. The property remained abandoned and undisturbed until 1987, when the diocese sold it to private developers planning to convert the buildings into luxury apartments. Construction crews reported immediate difficulties, including equipment failures, unexplained accidents, and workers refusing to return to the site after experiencing what their testimonies describe as presences and voices speaking from empty rooms. The most significant discovery came when excavation began for new foundation work. Workers uncovered a mass grave containing at least 74 distinct sets of human remains, all showing signs of the ritualistic post-mortem modifications documented in asylum records. More disturbing was the arrangement of the bodies, positioned in a spiral pattern with all faces turned downward, towards something deeper in the earth. Archaeological assessment of the site revealed that St. Aurelia's had been built upon much older foundations. Ground-penetrating radar identified structures predating the 14th century monastery, possibly as ancient as pre-colonial Native American settlements. Core samples revealed unusual mineral compositions in the bedrock, including veins of an unidentified black substance that geological analysis could not categorize within known mineral classifications. The development project was abandoned in 1989 after the primary investor committed suicide, leaving a note that mentioned her voice coming through the heating vents and faces in the walls that aren't faces at all. The property reverted to county ownership and was designated a restricted area, officially due to structural instability and environmental contamination. Since its abandonment, St. Aurelia's has become the focus of numerous paranormal investigations. Equipment failures are common, with electronic devices malfunctioning or recording unusual data. Audio recordings frequently capture what acoustic experts describe as voices speaking in multiple tonal registers simultaneously, often reciting religious texts backwards or in unknown languages. The most consistent phenomenon reported by visitors is the appearance of the woman in white, now witnessed by dozens of independent observers. Contemporary descriptions match those from the asylum's operational years, a female figure in white clothing whose face appears smooth or unfinished, and who moves with liquid grace. Modern accounts add that she is frequently accompanied by smaller figures that remain in shadow, and that electronic equipment invariably fails in her presence. Perhaps most disturbing are the reports from neighboring properties. Residents describe hearing female voices singing hymns at night, always from the direction of the asylum despite its abandonment. Local wildlife avoids the area entirely, creating what biologists call an unnatural dead zone, extending approximately 1 mile in all directions from the main buildings. In 2010, a team of university researchers attempted a systematic study of the site, combining historical analysis with modern scientific methods. Their preliminary findings, published before the project's unexpected termination, include several notable observations. Electromagnetic readings throughout the property show unexplained fluctuations corresponding to religious holidays, particularly All Saints' Day. Soil samples from the former garden areas contain human DNA mixed with unidentified organic compounds that behave unlike any known biological material. Thermal imaging reveals cold spots that move throughout the structure in patterns suggesting purposeful movement. Audio recordings capture what linguistic experts identify as an extinct dialect of Algonquian, a Native American language family not spoken in the region for centuries. The research project ended when the team's leader, Dr. Martin Chambers, disappeared while conducting solo night observations in the chapel area. His final research notes, recovered from his laptop, contain a single entry: "The singing is coming from below the floor. The woman is here. She says they never left. She says they're still waiting. She says the nuns were right. This place was always hers." The most recent significant incident occurred in 2019, when urban explorers illegally accessing the property live-streamed their investigation to a social media audience. The footage, viewed by thousands before being removed from platforms, shows the group entering the main chapel shortly after midnight. At timestamp 37:42, all flashlights simultaneously fail. In the darkness, viewers reported seeing a female figure moving among the explorers, though none of the team appeared to notice her presence. The stream ended abruptly at timestamp 42:17 with sounds of screaming and a final image of what analysts describe as a face filling the entire frame, human in general structure but with proportions and features inconsistent with normal human anatomy. All 4 explorers were later found on the asylum grounds, alive but unresponsive, exhibiting symptoms consistent with catatonic schizophrenia. None have recovered sufficiently to provide accounts of what occurred. St. Aurelia's Asylum remains standing today, its stone walls blackened with age and its windows empty like sightless eyes watching the surrounding forest. County records list it as condemned, awaiting demolition pending resolution of environmental concerns, a demolition that has been scheduled and postponed 7 times in the past decade. Local officials cite funding issues for the delays. Construction companies refuse the contract regardless of the offered payment. Equipment sent to the site experiences unexplained mechanical failures. And workers report the same phenomena that have been described for decades: unexplained sounds, moving shadows, and the persistent feeling of being watched by something ancient and patient. The true nature of what dwells within St. Aurelia's walls remains unconfirmed. Was it merely human cruelty that created a focal point for human suffering so intense that it left psychic scars on the landscape? Or did Sister Agatha and her successors actually contact something older than Christianity, something that wore human form but was never human at all? What seems certain is that the St. Aurelia's Asylum never truly closed. The doors may be sealed, the windows boarded, but something still walks its corridors. Something still sings ancient psalms in the darkness. Something still waits. For St. Aurelia's was never merely a place where the mentally ill were imprisoned. It was where something else was set free. If this dark journey through St. Aurelia's history disturbed you, remember to like and subscribe. Some stories end, but some merely wait, like whatever still dwells behind those asylum walls, for new witnesses to hear their whispers.